Today's daf, we're going to be learning a Sanhedrin daf Lamed Bet. It's the daf for Shabbat, and it's the first daf of the fourth chapter of Sanhedrin. Echad dinei mamonot ve'echad dinei nefashot b'derisha u'b'chakira. So the Mishnah starts off equating between dinei mamonot and dinei nefashot. We saw this drasha a few days ago. Shene'emar mishpat echad yelachem. And as I mentioned back then when we learned it, that the psukim there, the context of the psukim that appear before this pasuk, it's in Vayikra chapter 24, talk about murder and being punished for murder, and talk about dinei mamonot, monetary payments for damages caused. So from there, we learn that the laws are the same for both. Now, for what issue? For drisha and chakira, for the fact that we need to question the witnesses, and we need to do also drisha, also chakira. We're going to get later to what the difference between drisha and chakira is, but really getting to the questions, making sure the adim have the facts straight. Okay, different kind of facts we'll get, and we'll deal with what the differences are. But now it's obvious to the Mishnah that there are differences. It's not all equal, like the pasuk makes it seem. So now we're going to have a whole list of differences between dinei mamonot and dinei nefashot, between monetary law and capital law. Dinei mamonot b'shlosha, dinei nefashot b'esrim v'shlosha. This brings us back to the very first chapter. Dinei mamonot are judged in a court of 3, capital crimes in a court of 23. Dinei mamonot putchim ben l'schut uben l'chova. The first judge to speak can either decide I'm going to speak about I want to convict or I want to exonerate. V'dinei nefashot putchim l'schut ve'en putchim l'chova. When it comes to capital crime, first we start with the judges that think the person should be acquitted, and only then do we go to the ones who think that the person's guilty, because we don't want to start with the ones that are guilty. Perhaps then they'll convince everybody else and nobody will actually really try to acquit the person. And when it comes to dinei nefashot, we're going to see in many ways we want to always try as best as we can to try to get the person acquitted. Dinei mamonot matin al pi echad ben l'schut uben l'chova. We also learned this before. Dinei mamonot, you just need a majority of 1. But whether it's to that they'll be guilty or innocent. Dinei nefashot matin al pi echad l'schut. If you want them to be innocent, then, if the ruling is innocent, then all you need is a majority of 1. But al pi shnayim l'chova, if you're going to convict them, you need a majority of 2. Dinei mamonot machzirin ben l'schut uben l'chova. If you have a case of dinei mamonot and all of a sudden you find out later that there was a mistake, or somebody says, oh, I can change the judgment, you can change it either direction. But dinei nefashot machzirin l'schut ve'en machzirin l'chova. But if it's capital crime, we only bring in someone to say, oh no, don't convict this person. We think they're innocent, whereas we won't do it if they've already been declared innocent. We will not go back and declare them and open the case again to look into them being guilty. Dinei mamonot, hakol melamdim zchut v'chova. Dinei nefashot, hakol melamdim zchut ve'en hakol melamdim chova. Dinei mamonot, there was an assumption there were students in the room or other people in the room. If people think, oh wait, here's a good reason to say the person's guilty or innocent, then in dinei mamonot, monetary case, we accept anybody. Anyone can speak. But in dinei nefashot, anyone can come and say we see a reason to acquit this person, but not to say the person's guilty. Dinei mamonot, right? And then it would be only the judges can speak and not anybody else. Dinei mamonot, hamelamed chova melamed zchut, hamelamed zchut melamed chova. In dinei mamonot, if first you thought to say the person was guilty and then you decide to say they were innocent, you can do that, or the reverse. But dinei nefashot, hamelamed chova melamed zchut, if first you thought they were guilty, then you can change your mind. But aval melamed zchut ein yachol lachzor melamed chova. If you already said you think they're innocent, you can't switch your vote to guilty. Dinei mamonot, danim biyom v'gomrim balayla. Okay, all these, by the way, we're going to learn later. We're going to go through all these cases because now we're still in the Mishnah. Dinei mamonot, danim biyom v'gomrim balayla. Monetary cases we start during the day. If we're near finishing, you can finish at night. But dinei nefashot, danim biyom v'gomrim biyom. Okay, you finish it that day. You can't extend it into the night. Dinei mamonot gomrim ben biyom. Bo bayom ben l'schut ben l'chova. Dinei mamonot, you finish that day, whether it's schut or chova, and you can seal the deal. But dinei nefashot gomrim bo bayom l'schut. If you decide on a verdict and the person's innocent, you decide that day. Ubiyom shalacharav l'chova. But we do what's called halanat hadin. We push it off overnight so that hopefully we're hoping that somebody will come and bring a reason and rethink maybe and think, oh, maybe we should really acquit this person. We give it one more day. Lefichach, on account of that, Ein Danim Lo Be'erev Shabbat Lo Be'erev Yom Tov. We don't have a court case that starts a Dinei Nefashot on Erev Shabbat or Erev Yom Tov, because once we start the proceedings, we want it to finish the next day. Okay, even though you have to wait a day, we don't want you to wait more than a day. So we don't want to leave it over Shabbat. That's called Inoi Hadin. It's basically torturing the person, knowing that they're judging him and not knowing where it's going. So we don't start on a Friday or an Erev Chag. Dine mamonot, hatumot v'atarot, okay, whether it's dine mamonot or a case regarding whether something's pure or impure. Matchilim in hagadol. We start with the most prominent judge. They give their opinion, then we go around. Now, what's the problem? If you start with the most prominent judge, people are going to be swayed by what they say. So dine mamonot tumatara, we don't. It's fine. But dine nefasha matchilim in atzad. Okay, we don't start with the main person. We start with someone much less significant. And only later we get to the most prominent because we don't want them to influence what other people are thinking. Hakol sherim ladun dinei mamonot, and hakol sherim ladun dinei nefashot, ela kohanim leviyim Yisraelim hamasiim lekuna. This we also made mention of earlier in the Masechet, that when it comes to dinei mamonot, really anyone can be a judge, but not anyone can be a judge for dinei nefashot. Now there are rules; not anyone can be a judge, but people who have what we call psulei yuchsin. Okay, which is there's a problem with their lineage. Either they're a ger, a convert, they're a mamzer. Okay, those are people that can't marry kohanim. Because they can't marry kohanim, they can't judge. The same criteria are used to say they also can't judge dinei nefashot, capital cases, but they can judge dinei mamonot. Okay, now we're going to start with the Gemara on the Mishnah. So we're starting with the drisha and chakira, and the Gemara starts off with a question, and we're going to bring a source to contradict a braita. Dinei mamonot, mibi inan drisha b'chakira. Who says Dina Mamonot needs Risha B'Chakira? Now, it's funny. We started off, I just want to point out something interesting about the structure of the Mishnah. We started the Mishnah saying, Dina Mamonot, Dina Nefashot, they're all one and the same. Shpad Echad Yelachem. And we said they're one and the same for Risha and Chakira. And then we all of a sudden started saying, but how are they different? And we have this huge list of how they're different. Even though theoretically you would say Mishpad Echad Lachem, Yelachem, as if the laws are the same. And then the first thing the Gemara does is say, is it really true that you need Risha and Chakira for Dina Mamonot? As if even that first law seems to not be the case. How do we know it's not the case? Rimin, who contradicts the following source, it's actually Tosefta Makkot. Shtar shezmano katuv be'echad b'nisan b'shmita. We have a shtar that says the date on the shtar, let's assume it's a loan, is the 1st of Nisan in the Shemitah year. Now, this is a bit strange date. We're going to get back to this later because most people wouldn't loan money in the Shemitah year because if you loan money in the Shemitah year, by the end of the year, your loan is canceled. But okay, we have a loan that says on it the 1st of Nisan in the Shemitah year. Now, 2 witnesses come and say, those witnesses signed. They signed on the document in this place on that day. But halo b'yom ploni imanu ayitem b'makom ploni. Classic edim zomimim, although not exactly, because they're signed on a document. It's not that they said, we saw the following thing take place. They just signed a document. This loan took place on the 1st of Nisan. And they say, wait, how could you have been there? We were with you on the 1st of Nisan in the Shemitah year. Shtar kasher ve'edav kshirim. The shtar is a good shtar, and the edim are kshirim. They're not disqualified. We don't call them edim zomimim at all. Why? Maybe they post-dated it, right? Maybe they did the loan a year before, and they just wrote on it the 1st of Nisan in the Shemitah year. They post-dated it. We have post-dated documents. We've learned this before. I'm going to quote in a minute a Mishna in Shvi'it, which talks about shtar muchar is kasher, and that's why. Now, what does it have to do with our case? Well, what is drisha v'chakira? Drisha v'chakira, one of the things we do in drisha v'chakira, we check the date, we check the time, we check all those basic things. So, isak datach b'yinan drisha v'chakira, heichei cheshinan, shem ichru v'katvuhu. If you need drisha and chakira, then the witnesses have to have said, yeah, that date, that matches, and the time, and all that. And then if they're there, and then the edim zomim come and say, you weren't there, then we're going to have a problem. So how could we possibly even... the real question is, how can you even have a shtar meuchar, right? A post-dated document, but it's really asking on this braita of how could we say that this shtar is kasher? To which the Gemara responds before they get to an answer. They say, you had an even better question, as I said a second ago, really, which is v'litamech tikshelach manitin. You should have quoted a Mishnah. Forget about this braita. Always better if you quote a Mishnah. Shtarei chov, and this is a Mishnah from Shvuot. Shtarei chov hamukdamim psulim v'hamucharim kshirim. Oh, sorry. It's a Mishnah in Shvi'it, not Shvuah. My mistake. It's a Mishnah in Shvi'it, in the Masechet Shvi'it. Correct? It looks that way. Okay, so Shtarei chova mukdamim. If you have a document Okay, so Shvi'it, not Shvuot, my mistake. Shvi'it is about the Shemitah year, and Shvuot is about oaths. We're going to get to Shvuot soon. So if you have shtarei chov that are mukdamin, if they're predated, right, the date comes before, they're psulim, they're disqualified. What's the problem? Well, the problem is if we only loan the money now and it says an earlier date, then theoretically the property is liened from the date, and then we're going to have a problem because people could collect from property that wasn't liened, but they think it was liened, and that's going to be a problem for all the people who bought land from the borrower from that date that's written on the document. But hameucharim ksherim, but if it's post-dated, it's totally fine because you don't have that problem. Now, again, same thing. Right? If you need drisha and chakira, then the mucharim shouldn't be ksherim because again, you have to have your dates right. You have to check out all the information. So basically what they're saying is, why do you ask the question from the Braita? You should have asked the question from the Mishnah. Much better to have a question from a Mishnah. So the Gemara answers, halokashya, that's not difficult. Okay, they're going to first answer the second question, which is, why didn't you ask the question from the Mishnah? And then we're going to get back to the question itself. Actually, the Braita was a better question. Why? Even a star that on the first, right, if you have a star that's on the first day of Nisan, on the Shemitah cycle, that's a very rare kind of star. It's very hard to say, oh, maybe they pushed it off. In other words, what happens? You bring this star into court. This star already looks like a forged star because why on earth? Okay, if you're going to say, you might be able to say here like this. The witness, right? The documents in court. Two witnesses come and say those witnesses were with us on that day. It couldn't possibly happen on that day. Yeah, you want to say it happened earlier and they pushed it off to this day, but why would anyone post date a document? Now, first of all, for the Malva, it's always in their worst interest to post date a document because it means that you can only get lien property from that date onward. Not only that, but it would be a silly idea for a Malva, besides that they lose out, to post date a document to the first of Nisan in a Shemitah year because it already looks like a forged document. Why? Because who on earth would lend money on the first day of Nisan in a Shemitah year when by the end of that year the loan is going to be canceled? So the point is that afilu hachi kevan de shvi'it sofam shemetet machshirinan, right? Even though in the end the Shemitah year is going to be canceled, still we say it's a good star. And that all the more so provides us with the bigger question about Drisha v'Chakira. Because this is such an unlikely star. In other words, it's so easy to say it's puzzle, and it's a bigger chiddush that we actually say it's okay. So, mikom makom kashe, in any case, we still have our question, which is if Drisha and Chakira is definitely required, then why isn't it required here? And basically the assumption is it's clearly not required because these agents were proven wrong, the date was wrong and all that, and the judges obviously didn't do Drisha and Chakira here because if they did, they would have also realized the date was off, and that doesn't seem to bother us that the date is off. So how could this be? Now we're going to have a siman for the answers, Chet, Resh, Pei, Shin, Harpash, which is the names of the rabbis we're going to see. So first answer, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Dvar Torah, Echad Yidei Mamonot, Echad Yidei Nefashot, B'Drisha v'Chakira, Shneimar, Mishpat Echad Yelachem. The Mishnah is talking about by Torah law. By Torah law, Mishpat Echad Yelachem, monetary law needs Drisha and Chakira. However, Matam Amru Dinei Mamonot Lo B'Ina Drisha v'Chakira, but what the Mishnah doesn't discuss is what happened over time. Okay, this is a bit of a difficult answer because why would the Mishnah describe something that was and not something that is? Because the Mishnah usually is trying to tell us how to live now. But the point is, you could sometimes, we use this answer sometimes, that the Mishnah was talking about a particular time. And nowadays we don't need it. Why did they change it? If the Torah requires Drisha and Chakira, who are the rabbis to say no? Well, Kadesh Alotina Ol Delet B'fnei Lovin. And this is very common. It's why we have Prusbal. It explains a lot of different halachot. We don't want lenders not to lend out money. We want creditors to be able to say, oh, you want money? Here, I'll lend you money. And if we say you're going to have to prove it and you're going to need Eidim and we're going to do Drisha ben Chakira to them, and if they slip up on something, we're not going to accept their testimony, well, then no one will lend money because it weakens their position to get their money back. Okay, to which the Gemara asks, wait a minute. If it's all because Shalot and Odela Bifnei Lovin, Elameata, turning now to Amabet, Ta'u Lo Yishalmu. Now, the law is if the Beit Din makes a mistake, they don't pay. And now, right, I said, if the Beit Din makes a mistake, the court has to pay for it, okay? Well, it depends on the case, but let's just talk about it right now. If Ta'u Beit Din, they shouldn't have to pay. Why? The Beit Din can say it's not our fault. You didn't let us do Drisha and Chakira. Had we done Drisha and Chakira, we would have been able to get to the truth. We couldn't get to the truth because we couldn't do Drisha and Chakira. And therefore, if you're going to say the whole thing is that by Torah law there's Drisha and Chakira, but we said there isn't, well, then it should be unfair to make the judges pay if they make a mistake. To which the Gemara says, what do you mean? If the judges don't pay when they make a mistake, nobody's going to want to lend money because they're going to say there's no guarantee for us, right? If the judge makes a mistake and we don't get our money back and then the judge doesn't reimburse us if the judge made a mistake, well, it's not worth it for me to lend money. Look, I'll never get my money back, or it's possible I won't get my money back. So for all those reasons, again, this is Drisha and Chakira really was by Torah law, but they basically passed over that law and said, forget about it because it will stop people from loaning money. Second answer, Rava Amar. Very simply, we say the Mishnah that we quoted in Shvi'it and the Braita that we quoted about the Mu'uchar, where there's clearly no request for Drisha and Chakira, that's in the world of loans. Because in loans, we want to make it easier for people to loan money. But our Mishnah is talking about knas. Our Mishnah is talking about fines, penalties, okay, like kefel for stealing or things like that, okay? Now, what's interesting here is that they skip the middle part. What about regular, theft that doesn't have double payment? Like, what about damages to property or things like that? So they don't talk about the middle ground, but what they're going to say, right? So there, it's a subject of debate. But what they're distinguishing between is our Mishnah talking about knas, fines, penalties, and the other sources we're talking about loans. Rav Papa Amar, third answer. Idi v'idi b'hoda'ava halva'ah. Kam b'din merumeh, kam b'din she'ein merumeh. Well, the judges, when they look at a case or they look at witnesses, they have reason to think this person's suspect or not suspect, okay? Whether it's facial expressions, whether it's previous history of the people. So whatever it is, we're going to distinguish. If they have reason to suspect the person was lying, then they have to do Drisha and Chakira. And that's what our Mishnah is talking about. The sources that didn't require Drisha and Chakira was a pretty straightforward case. It seems pretty straightforward, and you have no reason to think the witnesses are lying, then you don't need to do Drisha and Chakira. How do we know this? Could Rish Lakish? To Rish Lakish Rami, Rish Lakish raised a contradiction between two psukim, and from here we're going to get off on a tangent on how to read these two psukim. Tzedek tishpot amitecha, with righteousness you should judge your friend. Uchtiv tzedek tirdof. Okay, run, chase after justice. Now, why does it say justice twice in one pasuk and justice once in another pasuk? We're assuming there must be two different things going on here. So haketzad, how does this work? To which they answer, ha b'din merumeh, ha b'din she'enu merumeh. In other words, you have to really, really seek justice, perhaps by Drisha and Chakira, and that's tzedek, chase after tzedek, when it looks like there's something wrong going on here. But when everything is fine, so tzedek tishpot amitecha, judge with, judge properly, but not overboard. Okay, now we're going to have a different explanation. Rav Ashi Amar Manitin Kedishanin. He says, listen, I don't disagree with Rav Papa's answer or perhaps any of the other answers, Rava's answer or the first answer. I'm forgetting now who said the first answer. Let's just back or Rabbi Chanina's answer. Okay, any of those are possible. But I disagree with Rish Lakish's issue with this contradiction between tzedek tishpot amitecha and tzedek tirdof. The psukim echad l'dim echad l'pshara. When it talks about tzedek tirdof, forget tzedek tishpot amitecha. He's saying tzedek tirdof is talking about one tzedek is for din and one is for pshara. There's two ways to go in court, and this we discussed already earlier in the Masechet. You can go by the letter of the law, or you can use compromise. Kiditani, as it says in the following Braita, tzedek tirdof echad l'dim echad l'pshara. So here comes Rav Papa's proof. Tzedek tirdof is, also, sorry, Rav Ashi, my mistake. It's Rav Ashi. I was right the first time. Rav Ashi's proof is tzedek tirdof. Here it is in a Braita. One ladin, one l'pshara. Ketzad. How does this work? So when do you know to use din and when do you know to use pshara? So they bring in a parable or however you would call it, an example. Shtei sfinot of rop nahal upaguz bezeh. We have two boats trying to get through a river, and it's very narrow, and there's not enough room for both of them to go. Im avrot shtehem, if they both go together, shtehen tovot, they're both going to drown. One goes first and then the other one. So they'll both go through. Or you have two camels walking on this ascent to Beit Choron, which is very narrow. They're stuck, one meets the other. And if they both go together, they'll both fall and die. But if they go one after the other, they both go through. So now the question is, how do you choose who goes first? So, haketzad. So what would be the case? Ti'una, we're going to give two possibilities. Ti'una she'ena ti'una, if one is much heavier load on it and the other one is a much lighter load. Tidache she'ena ti'una mipnei ti'una, we're going to let the one with the heavier load go first because it's much more of a burden for them to wait. Krova v'she'ena, krova, if one is much closer and one is much farther away, tidache krova mipnei she'ena krova. We're going to give the one who has a much farther way to go first. But hayu shtehen krovot, shtehen rechokot, if they both were close, the same distance, or both were the same distance far away, or let's say they both had the same burden on them, hatil pshara beinehem u'ma'alot tzachar zo lazo. So what do? You make a compromise. You let one go first, and the other one compensates them financially for having let them go first. So, right. So now we have, sometimes when it's clear, one is right and one is wrong, we should use din. When it's not clear, and basically it could go either way, then you have to use compromise. And that's what Rav Ashi understands tzedek tzedek. So we got off on a tangent after having three possible answers as to why does the Mishnah say we need Drush and Chakira? And the other sources seem to say not, right? Where we said either it's because Shalot and Oldel B'fnei Lovim and the rabbis changed the Torah law, or the Mishnah is talking about Knas. The other sources are talking about loans, or everything's about loans, but it's a matter of, do you think someone's tricking or do you not think someone's tricking? If you think someone's tricking, that's the Mishnah, and then you have to do Drush and Chakira. If not, that's the Mishnah in Shvi'it and the Braita, okay, or the Tosefta actually. And then, the Tosefta. And then we got off on the tzedek turdov. So the first explanation, Master of Papa, which is the difference between din merumeh and not merumeh, and the tzedek turdov is talking about two different types of, right? Tzedek turdof is if it's merumeh, if someone's tricking, or you're suspect of that, and tzedek tishpana mitecha is not, if no one's tricking. Then you don't need the double, really chase after justice. Rav Ashi says, no, tzedek turdof is dinim pshara, all in that one pasuk. Okay, now we're going to keep on with this. Tanu Rabbanan, with this tzedek turdof. Now we have a braita. Here's another explanation. Go find the right tzedek turdaf. Okay, now if we go back to tzedek tishpana mitecha, that's meant for judges. Tzedek turdaf is meant for litigants. The litigants should go to a beit din yafeh. If you have a better court in your town, go to the better court. Don't go to the people who don't really know what they're doing. Achar, like for example, Rabbi Lezer lelod. Achar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai livror chayil. Now, if we're already talking about Bror Chayil, which was a place, that's where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a judge. Tana, it's a braita about this place. Kol Rechayim beborni. If you're in Borni and you hear the sounds of the millstone going, Shavua haben. It's a way of, the millstones are kind of crying out like an announcement, saying there's a bris, there's a brit milah, there's a circumcision. Now, if you're in, okay, we'll explain this all in a minute. Or Haner b'Bror Chayil, if you see all these candles in Bror Chayil, which is the place where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the judge, since we mentioned it there, we're mentioning something else about Bror Chayil, not really connected. Mishtesham. You know that there's a party going on. Some people think it's a party for a circumcision, like the previous. Some people say it's a sign for a wedding celebration. Now, what's going on here? So Rashi explains that what's going on here is we're talking about times where the Jews weren't allowed to do circumcisions and they weren't allowed to celebrate their weddings. And what they did was they didn't want the Romans or whoever was in charge to know about this. So they did regular sounds that people knew them was a sign for the following things. Okay, so Rashi explains why is the millstone the siman? Because the babies would be sick after, they would need medicine, and medicines were made in the millstone. They would grind up the herbs, and the candles were a siman for, either for the brit milah or for a wedding, where there's lots of light. And some of the commentaries say this is where there's a custom. The Actually, Tosfot says this. Tosfot says that, he quotes Rashi as saying it was Gzerat HaMelech HaMalchut, and, because of that, people couldn't do it. People couldn't do Brit Milah. So since they couldn't circumcise, they were worried about having a noise. And they quote from the Yerushalmi also about this kind of thing, that there's some source that it sounds like the same. Okay, he quotes the Yerushalmi, Gzerasha Gazru B'Yudad Teka'amar Masiman Hayakol Migros Beborni, the noise of the chopping of the millstone, and Or Hanir B'Brochayil. Okay, they have it a little different, but that's the idea. And then he says, he says it could be even, they did this even just for happiness, like the lights, candles and lights are always a sign, and maybe it wasn't necessarily just Gzerat HaMalchut. And then he says, very interestingly, okay, I don't know if you have that custom, but he says the custom comes from here, to light a candle at a Brit Milah. Because either you say the Shavuot, okay, so first of all, the Yerushalmi's Gersa had the lights are the sign for the circumcision. And if you say Mishtesham could be a Brit Milah, then you would say that also. Okay, so anyway, then he quotes another thing about in Bava Batra about a minhag about putting a mapa on the entranceway to let people know they could come in or not come in. Anyway, he says that's also another source for another custom. What's interesting about this is that you see that there's sources for all sorts of customs we do that you can find in the Gemara. Okay, you might not do that. You might not like candles that you bring milah, but other people had that custom, and it all comes from here. Okay, so that was another interpretation of tzedek tirdof, which is, again, go find the better Beit Din. Okay, and that's what it means. And again, but tzedek tishbot mitacha is for the judge, and tzedek tirdof is for the litigant. And that explains another reason for the two psukim. Right? Rav Ashi didn't really relate to the reason for the two psukim. What Rav Ashi did was, he said, don't think there's something called tzedek, and there's tzedek. Tzedek is just a reference to judgment or compromise, and therefore there really is no contradiction. Okay, that was 3 answers. Now we're going to continue. We already said, by the way, about this, go find the proper Beit Din, and we gave this example of Rabbi Eliezer and Lod and Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai and Borchayil, and for that reason they're going to bring this other braita that relates to this kind of thing. Tanu Rabbanan, braita says, tzedek tirdof, halach achar chachamim layeshiva, go after the chachamim in the yeshiva. Like who? And they give a whole list of examples, some that we saw and some new ones. Achar Rabbi Eliezer lelod, achar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai leborchayil, achar Rabbi Yeshua lepki'in, achar Rabbi Gamliel leyavne, achar Rabbi Akiva lebnei Brak, achar Rabbi Matya leromi, achar Rabbi Chananya ben Tradion lesichni, achar Rabbi Yossi letzipori. Okay, these are all mostly in Israel, other than the truth is I didn't look up where Borchayil and Borni is, but Borchayil is on this list. Borni was on the other list, but I assume it's in Israel. All of them in Israel except for Romi, Rabbi Mati and Romi. By the way, we're going to get a Me'ila to a very famous story on Daf Yud Zayin that you might have learned with me before because I've taught it a bunch of different situations, but there's a story where they go to Rabbi Mati ben Charash in Romi, and there's a scene that happens in his Beit Midrash with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who comes to town. So here you see him. We'll remember that when we get to Me'ila, hopefully. And achar Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera l'Netzivin, and achar Rabbi Yeshua laGola. Okay, the Gola here, I wonder, I didn't look this up what it means, but let's see. Rashi says Lepumpadita. Okay, there they say Lepumpadita. But it's a little tricky because Rabbi Yeshua wasn't in Pumpadita. I see there's an aleph here. The aleph takes you to achar Chananya ben Achi Rabbi Yeshua, okay, which is someone else. Not Rabbi Yeshua, and achar Rebbe lebeit Sha'arim. That's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in Beit Sha'arim, right? That's where there's a big cemetery there where he's supposedly buried. And achar Chachamim lishkat Gazit. And after the rabbis, the big rabbis sit in lishkat Gazit in the Sanhedrin. Okay, now that resolved again, what we basically did since we started the Gemara was try to resolve this contradiction. The Mishnah says that you need Rishon Chakira for Dinei Mamonot, and then we saw the Mishna Shvi'it, and really they started quoting it from the Tosefta Makkot that said you don't need Rishon Chakira, or presumed you don't need because of the Shtar Mu'char, and no one's checking dates or anything. Obviously, wasn't Rishon Chakira, and we had 3 resolutions, and from that we got into this other contradiction between, or maybe there is a contradiction between Tzedek Tishbot Mitecha and Tzedek Tirdof. Okay, now we're going to move on. Dinei Mamonot Potchim. Okay, so now we have Potchim Lischut. So now the Gemara wants to know, Hechi Amrina, what do they say? Amar Rav Yehuda. Okay, so now we're going to say, right, so just to read for a second in Rashi, Hechi Amrina b'ptichat zchut, kishkiblu edutam shel edin u'delshum v'chakol mu'ba'in lisav l'tein, Hechi amrina lehu le'edim. So after they get the edim's testimony, what exactly do they say to the edim? Now we want to go lischut, which is really against the witnesses. The witnesses testified against someone, and now we want to say maybe there's a reason to say it's not true what the witnesses said. So what do we do? What does it mean putchim lischut? So we say to the witnesses, Amar Rav Yehuda hachi amrina lehu. This is what we say to them. Mi yemar kedekam aritu. Is it really like you say? Is it possible you're lying? So Amarle Ula v'achasmina lehu. Ula says that's like bullying them. That's like saying we don't trust you and pushing them into a corner to try to get them to say, oh no, I didn't really mean it. Okay, Rashi says, what do we mean here? We're muzzling their mouths, kashanu machishim otam, right? And what he's basically saying is you're scaring them. They're gonna immediately change their way. They're gonna say, oh, you're scaring me. Maybe I shouldn't have said what I said. And they might take it back, and that's not necessarily true. He's basically saying, why are you threatening the witnesses? Like they're kind of sort of innocent here. Why are you being very pushy and bullying about it? Milo Tanya, and doesn't it say? So now they say, what? The Gemara, I skipped a word. V'lichasmu. So what? What's wrong with bullying the witnesses? Aren't we going to learn? Milo Tanya, isn't there a bright that says, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Misi'in etaydim makom lamakom kadesh titaref da'atan v'yachzeru behen. Okay, this we're going to learn later on in the Masechet. It's on Daf Mem, where we talk about what do we do with the witnesses, and we bring them from room to room, and as we make them a little crazy, so they go a little nuts, and then we see, are they still saying the same story? Okay, so what do you see? We do bully them. Midame, they say, no, that's not the same. That's just taking them around from room to room and tiring them out to see, and maybe they'll change their mind on their own. But now you're being very pushy. It's like, is it really true? We said it's possible you're lying, and we're basically pushing them to say, I take it back. Okay, so that's not a good answer. We must say we say the following. We don't go to the witnesses. That would be scaring them and forcing them to kind of renege on their testimony. But we go to the litigant who's being convicted, and we say, Yesh cha'idim lazimam. Do you have any witnesses to make those witnesses into edim zomimim? You have anyone to bring to say, oh, we were with you at the time, and couldn't been the witnesses said this? So I'm really Rabba. Rabba says, what do you mean we try to find edim lazimam? Wait a minute. What's the whole point? If we turn these witnesses into zomimim, what we're basically saying is, right, we want to exonerate the litigant, in which case we're going to convict someone else. If the whole point is not to convict, then why are we pushing the litigant to convict or, bring someone who could potentially convict the witnesses? Then you're basically flipping it, and then you're going l'chovah, l'schut l'one is going to be chovah to the other. So they say, miyav yechovato, what do you mean? It's not a chovah, because Hadran, doesn't it say in the Mishnah, ein edim zomimim neheragim ad shikamer adin. Edim zomimim only get killed if they had already decided to convict the people who they lied about, and then they get convicted as edim zomimim, then they get killed. But if it's before Gemar Din, which right now we're definitely before Gemar Din, that would be the best time. Edim testified, and then we say, do you have any witnesses to knock them out? Now, if you knock them out, you'll knock them out, but they won't become edim zomimim that will get punished. So that won't be l'chovah of anyone else. So that's a good idea. To which they say, hachi amina. Now, this is what I meant. If you say to the litigant, go find witnesses lazim, and let's say he doesn't find anyone right away, or he decides to wait with it, until they finish the din, and then what's going to happen? He brings his witnesses and knocks them out. In other words, that situation could lead to convicting someone else. By you saying, do you have any witnesses to knock them out, and make them edim zomimim? If he does it, if he times it right, the litigant, he can actually convict them. So again, you're trying to do this all to exonerate one, but it's going to end up convicting someone else. And that defeats the whole purpose of what we're talking about. So Ela Amarabba, Amrin Amle, so he gives a different example. Okay, so now we're up to option 3 as to what exactly they say. Okay, so we started with they say the witnesses, are you sure you really meant that? Maybe you want to take it back. That's too pushy. Then we say, let's put it on the litigant. Do you have any witnesses lahazim? And then we said, no, but that's basically going l'schuto, which is going to the chovah of somebody else to convict another. So Rabbah says, Amrina le yesh cha'idim lahakhishan. They say, to have witnesses to knock them out. Now, lachish is just contradictory testimony, in which case it would knock out the first group, but without convicting them, because that's not edim zomim. Two people say one thing happened, and two people say something else happened, and they contradict each other. Then we don't know who's telling the truth and who's lying, and we knock everyone out of court. Right? We discussed that when we had the whole thing about ed zomim lemafreya hu nifsal milahat mikanu lahabat hu nifsal is ed zomim chidush. Right? Why do we believe those over those? But edut kasha, nobody thinks there's a punishment for the witnesses who lied because we don't know who lied. And then you would be convicting anybody, and you'd just be acquitting, or exonerating the litigant or the defendant, you could call him. Rav Kahana Amar, he says, you say something else. Midivrechem nizdaka ploni. So you say to the witnesses that from what you said, we can actually acquit this person. Now, even though they came against the person, okay, what they say is, Rashi explains like this. Kach potchim b'schut lachar kabbalat edut omer mitoch divrechem nizdaka ploni. So they kind of just start saying, it could be that based on what you said, he really is innocent, the litigant, the defendant. Okay, or she's really innocent. And then nosim v'notnim. Now, what does this do? This just opened. Now, it's funny, the witnesses came and said they're guilty, they did this and that. But judges should first say, it's not so clear. It could be the person's really innocent. And that just opens the discussion and have the judges in their minds start thinking about, maybe the person's really innocent. And that gets them thinking and going in the direction of innocent. And the truth is that would be the way I would have thought it in the first place. That potchim b'schut just means that we try to start coming up with ways that we can acquit the person and only later to the cases of convicting. So this just gets everybody already thinking in that direction. That was explanation number 4. 5, Abaye v'Rav Adamre travayu amrina le ilo katla lo titchal. They say to the defendant, listen, if you didn't kill, don't be worried. We'll get to the truth. And what they do is they try to calm the defendant to make the defendant feel calmer that if they really are innocent, not to worry, we'll get down to the truth. Rav Ashi Amar, kol mi sheyodea lo zchut yavo v'yomar alav. So now we have an answer, a final answer. Okay, I think that we're up to number 3, 4, 5, 6. This is number 6. You basically make an announcement. Before you start ruling, you say, is there anybody else here? Is there someone, after the Edim said this person's guilty, is there anyone here who can say something to defend the defendant? Tanya Kavatei Dabai Varava. We're going back to option number 5, and we're going to bring a source to support. And with that, we're going to finish for today. Rebbe Omer, Im lo shachav ishotach v'im lo satit. This is by the Sota. And they say to her first, if you didn't sleep with this man, if you didn't, you're not a Sota woman. And that's where we learn it from. That you have to first start saying, if you didn't do this, right, then don't worry, nothing will happen to you. And that's exactly what Abaye and Rava said. And with that, we finish our daf. So again, what did we do today? We had first the Mishnah, which in the very beginning said it's all the same Dina Mama and Dina Nefashot, but for Drisha and Chakira. And then we went into all the differences between them. There's a lot of cases actually where there's differences. And we went through the whole list of differences. That was the Mishnah. Then we got to the Gemara where we said, is it even really the same in Drisha and Chakira? And we brought 3, and we said not from the Tosefta and not from another Mishnah. And we brought 3 answers to that resolution. And again, we had a bunch of 3 different explanations to the contradiction between Tzedek, Tishponu Mitecha, and Tzedek Tirdof. And then we got to how do we start open l'zchut? And for that, we saw 6 different possible answers. Some were actually rejected, and some were, a bunch of them were accepted. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and Shavua Tov.